Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Welcome to the Mad in America podcast. I'm Richard Sears, science writer for Mad in America, here today with Marcela Ot'alora. Ms. Ot'alora works with the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies as the principal investigator for government research into MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. She also worked as a co-therapist during the first phase of MDMA research and currently leads the MDMA therapy training for MAPS. In addition to her research, Ms. Ot'alora works as a therapist utilizing fine arts in the treatment of trauma. Welcome, Ms. Ot'alora, and thank you for making time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
So, wondering if we could start by you just telling us a little bit about what brought you to your work, both as like a therapist and artist, and also what drew you towards your interest in psychedelics and MDMA?
Yes. So I started first as an artist, and I still am. And mostly I think I came to that from having dyslexia and not being able to understand things in a way that I felt that others could understand it. And I really struggled with it. And art was a way for me to really communicate and to be able to feel like I could express myself in that way. So that's how I came to art. And in terms of psychedelics, was doing my own healing with psychedelics, with MDMA-assisted therapy specifically, and just realizing how profound that was and how it changed the trajectory of my life. And I wanted to be able to work towards making this accessible for other people. So it started then, so 37 years ago, in that process of really wanting to bring this to where it is today, or more like where it's going to be maybe in a couple of years.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about the research that you have been doing with MAPS. I know there were, I believe, 3 phases, phase 1, 2, and 3. And just kind of what were you guys doing in general? What were you investigating? And what did you find?
So the first investigations were mostly phase 1 about safety, right, and what populations to use, and animal studies, and I wasn't a part of that. So I came in the phase 2 studies. We did a phase 2 study in Boulder, and mostly to investigate safety, continue investigating safety, efficacy, how it was working for the population of PTSD, and dose response. So in phase 2, we used 3 different doses to kind of investigate what those 3 doses would do. And now we're doing a phase 3 study. And again, safety, efficacy, but a phase 3 is also the good findings that we had with phase 2. Could those be duplicated in multiple sites? So we have 15 sites, including 2 in Canada, 1 in Israel, and the rest in the US. And I don't know if you saw the results of the first part, the first study for phase 3, very, very promising results that was published in Nature Medicine. And we're finding that it's really positive, really, really positive results, especially for this population. So now we're doing another study for phase 3. This will be the last study before we apply to the FDA for a new drug administration for MDMA to become a medicine for PTSD and hopefully other conditions as well. We also do a study, which is a healthy volunteer study, which is for therapists that we've trained to do this work, for them to have an option of also having an experience with MDMA as part of their continued training. And it looks exactly the way that they're going to be doing it. So that's called a healthy volunteer study.
Oh, interesting. So you mentioned on the horizon, we're kind of hoping to get this approved for use in more psychotherapy, correct? How far away does that seem like it is? Like, how long do you think that'll take?
Well, our goal is 2023. I'm holding on to that one.
So I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit about how psychedelics in general facilitate healing. I know you're obviously doing the research with MDMA, but I believe you've also done some stuff with ketamine too, as well. Is that correct?
Yes, I do ketamine in my private practice.
Right. So, from your perspective, what is it about these drugs that, like these altered states, that allow for healing that might not occur otherwise, or that might be more difficult otherwise?
I think the non-ordinary state that psychedelics provides a different perspective. So it's like looking at your own life from a different perspective than maybe you hadn't looked at before, an angle that you didn't have access to before. And in doing that, is being able to come home to yourself. So now this is about me, who I am as an individual in this very moment. So it's looking at yourself a little bit more objectively without the conditioning that we have acquired. And so it's a perfect place to start from, to work with trauma, to work with your issues, where it's not about, a lot of times therapy is about something needs to change right now, something needs to be different, something needs to be gotten rid of. And this treatment is not about getting rid of anything. It's about realizing that we don't get rid of anything and that we don't need to do that in order to heal. So that's one of the reasons.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if, again, I know you're mostly experienced with like the MDMA and the ketamine stuff, but do you see this as similar to this kind of healing has been around for a really long time. Like it's not something new that we're discovering, correct? It's kind
Absolutely.
of right.
I mean, we have a lot of traditions, indigenous wisdom traditions that have taught us a great deal about how to work with non-ordinary states.
Right.
And those have been going on for centuries.
And that's what I was thinking. This, in a lot of ways, sounds similar to me to something like, I've read about the like ceremonies that people do with ayahuasca and things like that. So again, kind of conjuring this altered state and being able to see things from a different perspective. Do you think there's some equivalences there with kind of the way that we're doing or trying to do now therapy with MDMA to those kind of more indigenous traditions?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, it's important to think about when we think about MDMA-assisted therapy, right? It's sort of like a Western term. But if you think about indigenous cultures that have used medicine, have used psychedelics in non-ordinary states, there is always a group of people, right? There's a community. There are the person or people are being held in this space. It's a sacred space of being invited in and with a lot of intention. And we do the same thing of having intention, of really paying attention to set and setting. What does it look like, the space where we're inviting people to do this work? Who is it with? We have our model is with two people, two therapists at the same time. So it's learning. What we've learned from indigenous traditions is the intention of it, the sacredness of it, and also the non-pathology of it. Like how that it's not coming in with a pathology, it's coming in with yourself. And how do we gather the parts of yourself that have been oftentimes marginalized because of trauma? How do we bring those back in so that you can begin to have a relationship with them?
So I know there may be some people in our audience that have read about some of the therapies. I know there's the MDMA stuff happening. I believe there's also some things happening with psilocybin now. So there might be some people in our audience that are considering pursuing some of this stuff. So what should someone that's considering this or looking at this as an option, what are some considerations they should look into? And are there certain maybe groups of people, certain types of people that this is going to work better for, or maybe certain kinds of suffering? I know you mentioned PTSD. Looks like it's, maybe doing well for that. Would it be helpful for other ailments, do you think, other kind of psychological suffering?
I'm sure. We haven't done extensive research on other ones. We've done some research on anxiety due to autism, or like social anxiety, and also anxiety with like life-term illnesses. So I think it would be helpful for other conditions. I do think there's a caution around how to do it, where to do it, who to do it with. I think that for sure people have had experiences on their own that have been incredibly powerful and meaningful and have changed their lives and have been very healing. And I have also seen and have been referred to my practice many times, people who have had additional trauma because of having a psychedelic experience where somebody wasn't there to hold space for them. Somebody didn't know what to do with what came up for them. Mm-hmm. And often the people who were taking them were not thinking that they were going to work with trauma. Some of them might not have even remembered that they had a traumatic experience. And a psychedelic can bring it up. And so important to know that the people that you're with are people who can hold any kind of space that you might be in. Mm. Because when that doesn't happen, then there's an additional trauma, right? Here's somebody who cannot hold space for me. This is not safe. What do I do with it? That can cause a lot of harm. So really being careful about how you choose who you're sharing this non-ordinary state with. It's a very vulnerable state.
Yeah, so you're kind of talking about harm reduction a little bit here too, right? Just
absolutely.
Yeah. So just to kind of follow that thread for a moment, what would you say to someone that had a difficult experience with like psychedelics? I know that can, like you're saying, right? It can kind of cause a trauma, like just having that experience, maybe not being around the right people or something like that. What would you say to somebody that's had an experience like that? Like, how might they go about integrating that or getting through it?
I think reaching out to people who are used to doing integration work with psychedelics, right? A lot of times people who have done harm reduction understand how to begin to integrate those experiences and how to help the individual maybe process what they would have processed then and couldn't because it got interrupted in some way. Because really, a psychedelic experience is not, it can be challenging, but it's not bad. And I think bad happens only if you don't have the space to kind of work with it. But the actual experience could be really difficult and really challenging and can be very powerful if somebody's there to help you through it. So it's finding somebody that can help you integrate it, that knows about psychedelic integration.
Kind of makes me wonder too if, and I mean, I'm not sure if you'll have anything to say on this one or not, but like if someone is already kind of using substances like this recreationally, I wonder if they can, I don't know, maybe get more out of the experience or maybe less out of the experience because they have this kind of recreational connection to it rather than the kind of the sacred space that you're describing. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah. And, I mean, I think a recreational space can also be a sacred space, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not excluding that. And I'm definitely not excluding getting a lot of benefit out of recreational use. And my experience has been mostly in a therapeutic setting. So I do think it's about the intention, right? If somebody takes a psychedelic and they want to, and they're in a safe space with people that they trust, and they're just having that experience of connection and bonding, that's a beautiful space for somebody to be in. And when somebody says, okay, I'm going to take this psychedelic with the purpose of addressing wounds in my life, addressing trauma, working through those in a therapeutic setting with therapists that can hold that space, is a very different space. And so I think it's sort of comparing two very, very different things. And we have had people that have maybe done some recreational use and have worked in the study, and it's like, wow, it's so different, but it's also powerful, right? They've had powerful experiences, and this is something that has a different intention.
Yeah. So it really has a lot, like you're describing, set and setting, right? So I'm wondering if you can kind of describe what a therapy session with MDMA or ketamine would look like, how you go about guiding somebody through that experience.
So ketamine and MDMA are two very, very, very different substances. Ketamine is short-lived with regards to, like, when I do a ketamine session with someone, it takes anywhere between 2 and 3 hours for the actual experience to be there, and to begin the integration process. And a lot of that integration happens after, and we can meet in a regular therapy session to integrate some of those experiences. And ketamine is very nonlinear. It doesn't have like a story that can be explained as this is a beginning, a middle, and an end kind of story. It's more a felt sense of what happens to the body and what happens to your experiences in life after you have it. And so it's a way to be mindful about how it has changed your reaction and the impact it has on your life after the experience. Whereas MDMA is much longer. So in the study, we stay with somebody for 8 hours. The two therapists stay for 8 hours with the participant from the time they take it until way after the drug has worn off, to begin that process of integration in the last few hours. And so they're pretty different. So the way that it looks like for MDMA in our studies is they come in and they take the medicine, and we offer a supplemental dose of half of whatever they took at the beginning, about an hour and a half later. Music is a very big part of it, of both, actually, both ketamine and MDMA. And in our study with MDMA, the music is there not as a suggestion to try to evoke something, but more as a support. So it matches the tone of what is happening in the moment. If the person is really calm, the music is very calm. If it's activated, if there's a lot of activation, the music is more activating. So it supports the process that is already happening. We offer eye shades and headphones if they want them. And we work with having times where they're inward and they're really thinking about and feeling into what's happening for them in the moment, listening to the music, and really having an experience of connection to themselves. And the rest of the time, they talk to the therapist. So it's kind of back and forth. The therapist might suggest this might be a good time to go inside. Maybe they've talked about something challenging and difficult that has come up, and they've worked some with it. And it's like, oh, maybe a suggestion to go inside and continue working with it and seeing what comes up for them. So it's a little bit of both. And if we start like at 9 o'clock in the morning, by 4 o'clock, it starts tapering down. We describe MDMA like a wave. It has these waves and they get pretty intense. And then there's a lull, like a little bit of a rest period. And then the waves happen. And then those waves get less and less intense as the day goes by.
So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how using these drugs for kind of therapeutic purposes compares to using something like the more commonly used medications that we might give now, especially for something like PTSD. So like benzodiazepines, a lot of times, I think, Xanax and things like that. So what does the harm profile for something like MDMA look like compared to the harm profile for something like benzos, in therapeutic use like this?
So, of course, there's risks to anything we take, right? There's always going to be risks, and we will continue to investigate and to research the safety of MDMA. I think a major difference is that we're offering MDMA 3 times, not something that you take every day,
right? Not
something that you need to continue to take for the rest of your life. Maybe later on, you might need another session. Sometime, if we're talking like post-approval, maybe that would happen. But is what can happen in 3 sessions. And I think sometimes, like the medicines that you're describing, like if you have a benzodiazepine and even like an antidepressant, right? They have their place for sure. And I think that they have helped people be able to live their lives, be able to work, be able to be okay, minimize some of their symptoms and the intensity of their symptoms. And there's also a lot of side effects with it, right? There's also a price to pay with that. And it's when to taper down from those so that we can begin to really address some of the other things that are there. That when we don't have the heightened state of suffering, we don't have the heightened state of joy either. And so what we're suggesting is taking a psychedelic where you can dive into, like, really move through the traumas, address them, see what's there. It's only the beginning. The session itself is the beginning. They have a lot of work to do afterwards, but it gives them a felt sense of what it's like to be connected to self, of what it's like to deal with their experiences in a way that doesn't debilitate their life, doesn't stop their life, right? Like, doesn't cripple them. And so they can really remember that, right? Because it's a felt sense of what that's like. And they get a sense of, this is what I need to do in the future when things come up, when I have difficulties. So it doesn't stop there, but it is a beginning of being able to be connected to that experiences that maybe before they were trying to avoid, or there was a fear every time that they brought it up, and there were a lot of symptoms associated with that, both psychological and physical symptoms. So it's a different kind of therapy, right? It's also a therapy that it's using a drug, but using psychotherapy with it at the same time.
And you mentioned too the MDMA treatments, right? So it's just like you would take it 3 times, not something that you're doing every day. And you mentioned kind of with benzos, there's that tapering down, benzos and antidepressants and several of the other drugs that we use. There's that kind of tapering down that we have to do. And I don't really have a question here. I just kind of wanted to highlight that, right? So very different way of treating. I don't think with MDMA, the use that you're describing, like withdrawal or tapering down or anything like that, wouldn't really be an issue. Am I correct in making that assumption?
Yeah, no, you wouldn't taper down from it. It's just an experience. By the end of the day, most people, if there was an adverse event that happened, like lack of appetite, or the senses are heightened, by the time that they leave after 8 hours, most of those are gone.
So that kind of, I guess, leads into this next question I have too, which is a really big one. So, we'll try to do what we can with it. But why do you think we consider some drugs therapeutic and not others? There's this whole class of drugs that we just kind of have excluded from, being used for healing for a really long time. What do you think's going on there?
Well, I think that, one, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of miscommunication, a lot of stigma that happens with specifically psychedelics, right? There's been so much appropriation of the way that from Indigenous cultures. If I think about one of the reasons why the first study was shut down was because there was all this misinformation that went out about the dangers of MDMA, and some of the things that were being written that are still in the internet, by the way, are like, MDMA causes holes in the brain if you even take it one time. And so there's so much misinformation out there. And has MDMA been dangerous? Absolutely. And most of the dangers that we have seen out there are, one, what is it cut with? What are you really taking when you take a psychedelic, which I think is probably the biggest harm that we have with psychedelics now, with them being criminalized, is that we don't know what somebody's taking. And that can really cause harm and death at times. If you think about most of the people that have gone to the emergency room after taking MDMA, it's due to anxiety. And And so I think that refers back to something that we were talking about before, where it's if anxiety comes up, if a trauma comes up that you didn't expect, if I'm not in a safe place, right? That can make the experience really difficult and challenging and scary. And so going to the hospital is the right thing to do. That's really most of the time that people go to the hospital with MDMA is because of that.
So I had kind of one more question concentrating on the psychedelics here. And this is actually from a colleague of mine that I was talking to earlier. So a lot of the drugs that we use kind of in psychiatry, at least a lot of authors think we kind of overprescribe them. We maybe prescribe them a little too often or a little too readily in some cases. I'm wondering if you think there's any kind of risks for these kinds of drugs, like hallucinogens in general, but specifically MDMA, in terms of like overprescription, maybe profiteering a little bit. Do you think there's a risk here for that kind of stuff to happen?
Well, I hope not.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that when MDMA hopefully becomes a medicine to treat PTSD and other conditions, it won't be that anybody can prescribe it. It would be that they go to a clinic with trained therapists who have a certificate to do MDMA-assisted therapy,
Mm-hmm.
and where they know where the medicine is coming from and they know what the treatment is like, and they can be tailored to an individual of what they need. So then, so I don't think that can happen. The same thing is not going to happen that has happened with antidepressants, for instance, or the way that we overprescribe, because I do think that there is overprescribing a lot, and that, now it is so amazing how many kids I see that have a lot of prescriptions for antidepressants or Adderall or anything like that. And a lot of it is mostly, I see it due to that we're averse to suffering. We think if somebody is sad and suffering because they're upset about something that happened, we immediately want to prescribe them something because they shouldn't be suffering. But suffering is part of life. Mm. And if my, like, for instance, I had a client that came in and it was their friend had died. Well, of course they're suffering, and of course they're in mourning and they're grieving and they're in pain. So prescribing something it's like, so we're taking that away. Maybe it's necessary at some point. If the person continues, maybe, at some point it's going to be helpful, but it shouldn't be our first response. It shouldn't be our first response. It should be way down the line. How can we actually help people and support people in what they're going through in a safe way, instead of just immediately saying, take this drug and then you're good to go. And that's what we're doing with MDMA, is come with whatever is happening in the moment. That's what we're going to work with, whatever the pain is. A lot of our participants say, I'm not sure why they call this ecstasy, because it's not necessarily fun.
Right.
It can have really beautiful moments, but it's also really challenging and a lot of hard work, and connects us to the fact that suffering is real and our pain is real, and that's not going to go away.
Yeah, I like that idea. It kind of, for me, connects to what you were talking about earlier, just having that space to hold certain experiences, and maybe for whatever reason, we don't make a lot of room. We don't have a lot of space to hold other people's suffering sometimes.
No, we don't. Or we think it needs to happen fast, right? Like if your family member dies, you get a week off of work or 2 weeks off of work, and then you should be done with that process of grieving.
Right.
This is not what happens in other countries.
Right.
Grieving doesn't happen like that. Grieving happens as a process, and can we as clinicians be there for that process?
All right. So I want to switch gears a little bit away from the really interesting psychedelic stuff, but I wanted to talk a little bit about fine art in therapy. How do you use fine art in therapy? What does that look like when you're doing sessions with that?
So I have done them a lot in my private practice, not with everybody, kind of just judging. Sometimes I suggest it to people and they say no, or sometimes I don't suggest it. The same thing with the study. I think that art is a way to arrive at a process non-verbally, so that sometimes our experiences don't have words. And that when we begin to give them words, they don't do justice to what it is that is actually happening internally. Whereas maybe a color, a splash, something that can be put down on a piece of paper, it's like, it looks like this, it looks like this. And I think any kind of the arts, I remember I used to work a lot with kids, and sometimes I had a drum, and they would say, I don't know how to explain what's happening for me. And I would say, can you explain it on the drum? And then they would like go wild with that drum, right? It's like, this is what it feels like. And that has no words, but boy, does it explain where they're coming from. So it's being able to access another part of ourselves, of giving, honoring what it is that we're feeling that might not have words.
So maybe you've answered a little bit of this next question already, but I still want to ask it. You mentioned, you might suggest it for some people and maybe not others. Is art therapy something that like a non-artist can find healing from? Do you need to have some background, or can you come in kind of fresh and still be able to get something from it?
Oh, I absolutely think so. Now, I'm not an art therapist, so I'm a visual artist, and I use art more autobiographically. So having people process some of their ancestry and their life experiences through art. So I'm not an art therapist, but I do think that it's not about being an artist at all, because we're not talking about what the end result is. We're talking about the process. Yeah. What is the process that is happening? It's not about creating something different. It's about having integrity of what is happening inside of us at the moment, right? So it's about, this is not going to be a work of art. This is going to be your work of art, about your integrity to your commitment to the process that you're in, your commitment to your intimacy with yourself and what can come from that. So it's not at all for just for people who might feel like they have that kind of creative outlet. It's for anyone who has feelings, right? Who can express feelings.
So I'm wondering if you can tell us about something you've learned in your work, in your research, or in your work as a therapist, or your work as an artist, just something you've learned that most of us maybe don't know and could benefit from knowing.
Well, I've learned a lot of things.
Yeah.
An important one is humility. I think I've learned a lot of humility. And by that, I mean, my clients and the participants in our studies have taught me that their healing looks so different than anything I could have imagined it would look like. That anything that I think would be helpful, or that I think their healing looks like, it's actually probably not true. And that if I come in leaving that agenda, leaving that bias aside, and being present with whoever is in front of me, they will surprise me every time about how healing looks for them and what they needed to do within themselves to get to that place of healing. And I think what that does too is being able to tell a participant, being able to tell a client, I don't know what your healing looks like, but you do. Even if you don't know it in this moment, you do. And I am here to discover that with you and to help you in that process. So it gives them the freedom to explore something that doesn't have an ending, that is wrapped up in a certain way that they think, oh, this is what healing looks like, because I've been told that in order for me, healing looks that I'm not going to suffer every time I see this, or this is the way I'm going to react to this situation. So it always has this kind of package deal that it already has the bow in it. It already looks exactly in a particular way. When the fact is that we don't know, and that we can be in the journey with them to discover whatever that is. That's what I've learned.
it kind of reminds me of just this discussion I was having with a colleague of mine not long ago about really just the trauma narrative in general. We have this idea that we kind of know what mental health looks like and we know what trauma looks like. And there are certain experiences that people have that must necessarily traumatize them. And then we're really puzzled if they're not traumatized by it, and how people can come from really different cultures and backgrounds and have these really what we might call traumatizing experiences and just be absolutely fine. My wife's family, for instance, is kind of like there was stuff happening in Kashmir and they had to flee from that, but there wasn't a lot of PTSD or anything like that. It's just, what you're describing, right? Like a completely different way of healing, a completely different system of understanding almost.
Yes. It's like cultural responsiveness, right?
Yeah.
How are we open and be curious about the way we respond and about the way people respond and what is important to them? Are they aligned to ancestors? Does their healing come from being able to work with the ancestors? Then let's go there, right? Does their healing come from nature? Let's go there. So it's really being able to be aware of that, be curious about it, ask a lot of questions, understand what our biases are and really know what they are and really put them aside and come fresh to the table with them, and also help them do their own, their own understanding of their parts, right? It's sort of like, how do the cultural responsiveness of all their parts, the parts that they like, the parts that they don't like, the parts that they understand really well, and the ones that they don't.
So this will be the last question I've got for you here. And I'm just wondering if in your work, particularly with psychedelics, but in any of your work, really, if you faced any significant pushback or consequences or criticisms for kind of doing work that's not, well, becoming more mainstream now, but hasn't been that way very long, right? It still isn't quite mainstream. So
yeah, a few years ago, it was like either people didn't know about MAPS or about psychedelic work, and either they didn't know it or they criticized me for being a part of it. And then all of a sudden, now everybody wants to be a part of it. So it's like things have shifted a lot. So I don't get a lot of that now, even though I still get a little bit. A few years ago, I did. I almost lost a job because there was an interview in the paper about this work before many people knew about it, and I was a therapist working in the schools, and a lot of people were upset about that. Wow. I think sometimes there's so much fear, right? Like, oh, you're promoting psychedelics and you work with teenagers, or you're promoting, and so there's all this biases, miscommunication, and assumptions that are made all the time about what we're really doing and the work that we're doing. And where I have encountered that is people who don't ask questions. They just have already made up their mind and they have this assumption in place. And, I remember being in a training one time, and in the training, we all went to lunch, and at lunch, people were talking about what people did. And I talked about it. And all of a sudden, there was no one to have lunch with for the rest of the week. Nobody would have lunch with me. And so it was without asking a question, right? Without saying, like, explain to me a little bit. It was just like, I heard the word psychedelic and this is what happened. And fortunately, that has changed a lot. And I hope that it will continue and that we can continue to give out information that is important for people to have so that they're not misinformed, for sure.
Thank you so much for talking with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Marcela Ot'alora. You can find out more about her research in MDMA therapy at maps.org/research/MDMA.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.